Shinju, or the divine tree humans we know, beings who possess a core called the togedama, or thorn soul bulb, actually have another concept tied to them that could serve as an alternative method to defeat them. Or in another scenario, a hidden instinct that could turn into a nightmare if Jura refuses to remain a servant of the OTSUTSUKI. Yep, I'm Nim without the E. And today, let's talk for a moment about the Shinju in a nightmare scenario no one has ever considered. So yeah, without us realizing it, every time a new chapter drops, there's always some plot twist or a detail that seems obvious at first, but ends up being completely different from what we expected. Even when a statement or confirmation comes from someone who can literally see the future, like Kashin Koji, it can still be wrong. Meaning, Ikimoto constantly creates new twists or reveals new facts that force us to rethink everything from scratch. And chapter 28, this wasn't just a normal chapter. This was a crucial chapter, one that might become the turning point of the war between Konoha and the divine tree humans. But strangely, the most important moment in this chapter was missed by most fans. You were probably focused on Boruto finally getting a new sword, or Inojin receiving a surprising buff, or even Konoha being invaded for the second time. All of those are exciting, and we can't deny that each part of chapter 28 has a big impact on the future of the story. What I want to say is this: the biggest weakness of the divine tree humans. And what's even more absurd is that this weakness has been right in front of us for a long time. And here's where things get really crazy. If Konoha manages to exploit this weakness, not only can the Shinju be defeated, but this could mark the end of the divine tree human threat forever. But on the flip side, if this weakness is used by Jura and the other divine tree humans, it could turn into a nightmare for Boruto, and even for Konoha itself. So yeah, speaking of the togedama, some of you might already know that the most crucial weakness of the divine tree humans is their togedama. But actually, that's just one of several possible scenarios and alternatives. However, one thing is certain: we have seen how divine tree humans are able to regenerate their bodies from any attack. No matter how much damage you inflict, divine tree humans will always have unlimited regeneration if their togedama has not been destroyed. However, as I mentioned earlier, the weakness isn't just about the togedama itself. For example, take Jura. Even though he is an incarnation of Jubi with unreasonable power, believe it or not, his obsession with love and the feelings possessed by every human being is actually a weakness that we are unaware of. His desire to know about love and similar feelings can be a very effective weapon to weaken him. In philosophy, love is always described as a paradox, the softest thing, yet capable of subduing the strongest. Jura, with all his new forms and identity as the incarnation of the Ten Tails, is proof that absolute power is never truly perfect. He seeks answers about love, emotions, and the meaning that only humans possess, yet that is exactly where the greatest irony lies. Because basically, when a creature that powerful becomes captivated by something it cannot understand, it opens up the most fatal flaw. Love is not just a feeling, but a concept that drives humans to fight beyond their limits, while at the same time it unintentionally causes beings like Jura to lose focus, lose purpose, and lose their true identity. And simply put, the things we chase often become our greatest weakness. And for Jura, his obsession with understanding love is a double-edged sword, one that may one day become the reason for his downfall. Then there's Hidari. Although he is one entity with Jura, he does not entirely share the same desires. However, at a point that we could consider his weakness, it leads to his own ability. And of course, I'm sure we all know who Sasuke is and who Hidari is, right? But if we're talking about Hidari, who only has the Rinnegan and not the Sharingan, I'm sure we all agree that this is part of his weakness. Because once again, all the techniques mastered by Hidari require the Sharingan to make them more accurate and stable. As Hidari himself said in chapter 11 when fighting Sarada. In short, he felt that controlling a technique like Chidori was very difficult. Even when Hidari saw how Sarada used that technique with her Sharingan, it was at this point that Hidari began to understand that there was something he had to obtain, and that was Sarada's Sharingan Eye. And finally, Mamushi, a Shinju we never expected to possess such a crazy ability, one that honestly sounds a bit ridiculous. He can split himself endlessly into clones that are just as strong as the original, but there's one major drawback. Every time he divides, it lowers his intelligence, basically making him progressively dumber. So, in conclusion, the greatest weakness of the Shinju does not lie in the togedama alone. That weakness comes from something much simpler: their own wild instincts. And regardless of how they have awakened their egos, leading to desires and other things, In the end, all of that leads to one instinctive goal that makes them eternal slaves to the OTSUTSUKI. They were not created to be free beings, not to determine their own goals, but to continue to grow, absorb chakra, and then produce the chakra fruit needed by the OTSUTSUKI to evolve. In other words, no matter how powerful their form or incarnation, they remain bound to their basic function, to serve the OTSUTSUKI. And as I said earlier, their current desires, when thought about more deeply, are just a formality that ultimately leads to one eternal goal. And of course, this is where an interesting question arises. If Jura is a different incarnation of Jubi, more independent, more curious, and more capable of thinking like a human, what would happen if he tried to transcend the Shinju's basic instincts? Is it possible that he is looking for a way to use the new god tree for his own interests? This is the point where a major theory begins to form. What if Jura intends to create a new god tree, but not to serve the OTSUTSUKI? But once again, this is an alternative scenario, one where consuming an OTSUTSUKI is no longer their main objective. And even though this sounds absurd and ridiculous, especially since growing a Shinju typically requires devouring an OTSUTSUKI, we should remember how history already proved that Kaguya managed to manipulate humanity and successfully grow a god tree. In other words, this isn't about rules or anything like that. It's about how another scenario, another alternative, could be created. In other words, we know that in the usual cycle, a god tree only grows after an OTSUTSUKI plants the 10 tails as a seed and sacrifices themselves. However, Jura is a unique entity, built differently from the start. He is not only the result of Shinju's transformation, but also has personal consciousness, desires, and obsessions. He wants to understand humans, is interested in emotions, and it's not impossible that he began to understand how the OTSUTSUKI work from the perspective of an intelligent observer. With that ability, does it make sense that Jura might one day try to create his own divine tree on a smaller scale? But let's say it does happen. How would he do it? Is it possible that he would use Konoha as a vessel to create a new god tree? This sounds extreme, but considering the Shinju's history of always searching for chakra, a ninja village with a strong concentration of chakra like Konoha would clearly be the perfect target. Moreover, we have seen how the roots of the Shinju in another dimension have a different form from the Shinju that grows in the original world. Those roots seem to be searching for a host, a medium, or an energy source that can be used as the foundation for a new god tree. From here, another even crazier speculation arises. What if Jura isn't trying to become the divine tree itself? Normally, when an OTSUTSUKI is consumed by the 10 tails, they transform completely into a god tree. But Jura is an anomaly. If he were to consume an OTSUTSUKI, the process might be entirely different. Maybe he wouldn't immediately transform into a full god tree. Maybe he would only trigger the growth of a new god tree while still retaining his humanoid form. And if this scenario is true, then Jura would be in a position that has never existed before, controlling the god tree instead of becoming part of it. He could harvest its fruit, consume the power he created himself, and ultimately become an entity far stronger than any OTSUTSUKI. So in the end, beyond all the theories and analyses that lead to one important conclusion, the greatest weakness of the Shinju is their wild instinct that forces them to obey or rebel against the OTSUTSUKI. That same instinct could become Jura's greatest strength if he manages to break that chain and exploit the god tree system for himself. And that means this is no longer about weakness, but about a nightmare in its truest form. And yeah, if that ever happens, it wouldn't just threaten planet Earth. The entire OTSUTSUKI hierarchy could collapse at the hands of a being that was supposed to be their slave. It's a discussion topic that I think becomes incredibly interesting when viewed from a different perspective. But if you have an even more intriguing perspective, let me know in the comments. I'm Nim, without the E, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye, Data Bio.